Who said louder? Oh, troublemaker, yes, I met you. Yes, I'm from Northern Ireland, don't normally have any problems with being heard. Welcome. It's very nice to be here. It's the third year in a row for me to come to the Cork International Short Story Festival, and it's a place I sort of feel like very home at, and people that always make me very happy are here, so I'm a wee bit jolly this evening. Tonight you're going to meet two short story writers, one from America and one from England. When I first saw these names, I used to write comedy for a living, and I could make like $1 million on these two guys if we just had Heathcock and Woodward. I mean, honestly, I could sell you guys around comedy. I mean, a comedy. If you want to do this as a career, just let me know later on. Okay, so let me a piece of paper or something.
Buddy cops. We'll be buddy cops.
You guys, I get, yeah. Ka-ching. That's what I hear. Right. Tonight I know some people get anxious about this kind of thing, so I'll just let you know how we're going to run. We're going to have Gerard's going to read first, and then we're going to have a little chat, and then about halfway through we're going to have Anne read, and then a little chat. And at the end you can ask a question. You might want to start formulating it while you're listening to these two guys, so that when you have the opportunity you're like not surprised that it happened. You know, we're going to ask questions, and so we're not having any of that, so you've been well warned. Our first reader tonight is Gerard Woodward, who was born in London in 1961. He's the author of Ravishing, Nourishment, an acclaimed trilogy comprising August, shortlisted for the 2001 Woodward First Novel Award, which I think is now the Costa. Is that right? I Go to Bed at Noon, shortlisted for the 204 Man Booker Prize, and A Curious Earth. His collection of poetry, We Were Pedestrians, was shortlisted for the 2005 T.S. Eliot Prize, and his most recent collection, The Seaconey, was published in 2012, and he is a professor of creative writing at Bath Spa University. Could you give him a wee round of applause? He's going to come read some from his collection.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to read from this new collection, Legoland, and I'm going to read the first story, not the first story, the title story of the collection, which is called Legoland. I'm not going to say anything about it because it's all very self-explanatory, I think. So I'll launch into reading it, but I'm not going to be able to read all of it because it's quite a long story, but I'll probably read about half of it. Okay, so here we go, Legoland. I got the phone call about 4:30 on a Saturday. The well-spoken, hesitant voice threw me for a moment. It didn't sound like the usual cold caller. So sorry to disturb you. I'm a consultant neurologist at Hill Hospital. We have a patient here who was brought in to us suffering from severe amnesia. Are you still there? Yes, I'm here. Well, this patient of ours, as I say, he is suffering from a very severe form of amnesia. He can't remember his name or where he lives or anything about himself at all. He has no means of identification, no wallet, driving licence, credit card, nothing. The only thing that has been found on him is a playing card, on which is written your name and telephone number. So I'm phoning to ask you if you can help identify him. This was quite a lot of information to take in, and I asked the consultant neurologist to go through it again. He did so, providing a little extra detail. The patient he was talking about had been found wandering along the hard shoulder of the M3 just outside London. The man had apparently seen a sign for Legoland, and intrigued by the name, but having no idea what it was, had decided to go there and find out. The playing card puzzled me. Was my name and number written on the back or front of the playing card? On the front, I was told. And what card was it? It was the 3 of Hearts. Could you describe the man? Yes, he is 5'8", medium build. I'd say he is in his early 30s. Brown eyes, short brown hair, no particular distinguishing features, though I would say, here the consultant gave a short pause and a half laugh, I would say he's rather a handsome chap. Most of my friends, when I came to think about it, were pretty good looking. It doesn't ring any bells, I said. Perhaps you'd like to speak to him? This threw me again. What, right now, you mean? Yes. You mean you've got him there sitting next to you all this time while we've been talking about it? Yes, he's been following the conversation with interest. I'll hand you over. There was a moment of telephonic fumbling. The dry, crisp breathing of the consultant was replaced by the shallow gasping of another man. I could hear a tremor in his breath even before he spoke, and I was expecting a rough, croaky voice to emerge, but instead it was soft, clean, and polite. "Hi," it said, in an empty sort of way. There was no warmth at all in the voice, no sense of expectation either. It was like he didn't think I would bother to reply, as if he'd sent his greeting out into the void. "Hi," I replied, then sensing that it was up to me to carry on the conversation. "So, we might know each other?" "Yeah, I had your number on me." "Right, on a playing card?" "Yeah, 3 of hearts." "You play cards much?" "I don't know." "You?" "I've never played cards, not since I was a kid." There was a pause. "So you've lost your memory," I said. "I suppose so." "That must feel pretty strange." "It feels weird." "You don't know where you live, what your name is?" "They say I've got a London accent, but that can cover quite an area beyond London these days, so I'm told." "You've got a London accent as well." "Your voice, it doesn't sound familiar at all, but I suppose if you've got my name and number, we must have met at some point." "What sort of places do you go to?" I tried to explain how many people I meet face to face in an average week. The stream of people who pass through the office, the people I meet in the pub every lunchtime, mineral water for me, usually, or in a cafe after work, the people I meet on the train to and from work, the people I play football with on Wednesday evenings. It must run into thousands. I give out my number sometimes if there's a useful contact to be made, or a potential client, but I don't usually give out my home phone number. That was odd. "You haven't lost a brother recently?" the amnesiac said, in a half-joking tone, the first sign of emotion I'd noticed in his voice. "No, I don't have a brother. I've got 2 sisters." He paused for a moment and then said, "That's nice." There was another rather awkward pause, and then the amnesiac continued. "Well, Mr. Stern is asking for the phone back, so I'd better say goodbye." "Goodbye," I said. "Goodbye." The brisk, efficient breathing of the consultant returned to the mouthpiece. "This is Mr. Stern again. Did our patient sound at all familiar to you?" "Not really," I said. "I don't think we've met." Mr. Stern seemed prepared for my lack of recognition. "I know this is a lot for you to take in," he said, "but do you think you could find the time to come to the hospital and see our patient face to face? His voice may sound different as a result of the amnesia. If you saw his face, or perhaps he might recognise you. Or if not, then at least it might trigger something else in his memory. Anything. We're rather desperate, you see. We have no other leads at all to this man's identity. And until we do, we can make no progress." I couldn't really say no, but I told the doctor I couldn't make it for a couple of days. I was going over to my girlfriend's place on the coast that evening and staying all day Sunday. I wouldn't be able to get to the hospital until after work on Monday evening. The doctor seemed put out by this, as though he'd expected me to drop everything and come in straight away. But it was only a case of memory loss. It wasn't as though he needed a new kidney. Surely he could wait a couple of days. Anyway, I thought, if I delayed a little, perhaps he would recover his memory in the meantime. Or perhaps someone else would claim him. But I should have gone straight away. I couldn't get him out of my mind while I was down at Gemma's flat. That empty little voice speaking into my ear, hoping that I might recognise it. How had my name and phone number found its way onto a 3 of hearts playing card? Gemma had a tiny flat right next to the beach. All it lacked was direct access to the pebbles. For that, you'd have to climb out of her bedroom window and swing down a rope to avoid the downstairs garden. We went for a walk along the shingle and hardly spoke a word to each other. Gemma had had one of her nightmares and was in a sombre mood. Then we found a strangely shaped piece of metal sticking out of the mud that Gemma decided was an unexploded mine. If she was so sure, I said, we should call the Coast Guard. But we didn't. We just went home again, silently. I didn't tell her about the amnesiac. So it was rather a relief for me when Monday evening came round and I made my way to the hospital. I thought I could get this business over and done with once I convinced the amnesiac that there was no connection between us. But we didn't know each other. After all. I would at least be able to stop thinking about him. He was in a room of his own, off the neurological ward. As the doctor had said, the amnesiac was a good-looking man, roughly my age, perhaps a few years younger. He was sitting in a chair beside his bed, reading a broadsheet newspaper. He had that dense sort of stubble that leaves a shadow even after close shaving. He was lean, healthy-looking. He had soft brown, very gentle eyes. The nurse who showed me in explained that Mr. Stern, the consultant, was not around at the moment. She said she would try and find his registrar. This meant I spent quite a while alone with the amnesiac. He stood up politely when I came into the room and we shook hands. His grip was firm and I could see the urgency in his eyes as he searched for something to recognise. For my part, I could tell straight away that we had never met before. There was not the slightest trace of familiarity about him. I could sense, however, that the amnesiac was not so sure. His eyes fixed on mine and wouldn't let them go. He looked at me constantly, unwaveringly. I felt like I was a magnificent portrait in a gallery, and he had travelled across the world to view me. He didn't want to waste a moment of his looking time. He even began mirroring my movements. If I looked at something in the room, he looked at it as well. If I went over to the window to inspect the view, he did too. I nodded at the pile of newspapers on the table in the corner. Trying to catch up, I said. Yes, he said, in his polite, soft voice. One of the staff had saved all their copies of the Times for the last few weeks and brought them in for me. The trouble is, I always need the previous day's paper to make sense of the one I'm reading, so it just keeps going back and back. You really can't remember anything, not even who the Prime Minister is? No. The other day they showed me a lot of photographs of people. I thought they were just showing me pictures of their folks. But apparently they were pictures of the Queen and the Royal Family. But you can remember how to talk. Yeah, good job, he laughed nervously. I can remember what they call generic memories. So I can remember that a tree is called a tree and that there's a sun and a moon and that people have to wear clothes and that you don't touch things that are hot. But I can't recall things that have happened to me, things that I've done, experiences. It's all just gone. I shook my head and blew out my cheeks, doing my best to express sympathy for his awful predicament. I needed to prepare the way for the worst news I had for him. Well, I said, squaring myself up, I'll have to say straight away that I don't recognise you. You don't even look vaguely familiar to me. To my surprise, the man expressed irritation at this. He jerked his head, frowned and tutted, as though I'd said something grossly unfair. Wasn't expecting that at all. I was expecting a shrug. He was a shrugging sort of man. The sudden burst of irritation annoyed me. "Oh, come on," he said loudly. "You've been in the room 5 minutes. You haven't given it any thought." "It doesn't matter," I said, raising my voice to match his, then quietening it. "You can tell straight away with a thing like that. You either recognise someone or you don't." "But maybe I look different. I don't know. Maybe I used to have a beard. Maybe I always wore a suit, not this." He tugged at his loose-fitting t-shirt. "Maybe..." He couldn't think of another example, but then reached into his pocket and produced the playing card. "So how do you explain this?" I took the playing card, interested to examine it. There on the front, sideways beside the 3 of hearts on the face, was written my name and my phone number. "It's not my handwriting," I said. I believe this was true. It was too small and too neat to be mine. "I didn't write this. Someone else has written it for you." "What do you mean?" The man snatched the card back and examined it. The thought that I might not have actually written it myself didn't seem to have occurred to him. "Someone has written down my name and number for you. I don't know why." "What do you do?" "I'm a designer." This seemed to cause the amnesiac a momentary problem of comprehension. He gave a barely perceptible shrug. "So if someone gave me your number, what would be the most likely reason?" looking for someone to design a lighting system for your home or your office. He looked at me in a lost sort of way. That's my area, I said, feeling slightly as though I was having to explain myself. Lighting systems, or specifically intelligent energy-saving lighting. Lights that come on the moment you walk into a room and go out as soon as you leave. Lights that don't have switches, but come on at the wave of a hand. The man was looking despondently at the floor while I said this. He looked up when I'd finished. That must be impressive, he said wistfully. Lights coming on their own. We each considered the implausibility of the amnesiac having had a need of my lighting design services. I'm sorry I can't be more help, I said, wondering how I was going to make my exit. The man seemed deeply crestfallen and returned to staring at the floor. I held out a hand, saw it wasn't going to be taken, and so quickly morphed the gesture into a shoulder pat instead. I hope you find out, I'm sure someone will. It's very difficult to find the right words. What I wanted to say was, I'm sure that someone will claim you, like he was a lost piece of luggage, a carelessly discarded umbrella. The man clearly wasn't going to ease my passage out of his realm, so in the end I just left. I realised, as I was leaving, that I hadn't seen Mr. Stern, the registrar, or anyone else. I hadn't officially denied a relationship with the amnesiac, and my non-recognition of him had not been witnessed by anyone in authority, and this fact bothered me as I drove home. 2 days later, Mr. Stern phoned again. Sorry to trouble you, I was wondering how the meeting with our patient went the other day. Hasn't he told you? He's given me his account of it. I'd like to hear yours, if I may. Well, I'm afraid I wasn't much use. I didn't recognise him at all. As far as I know, we've never met before. Oh? Mr. Stern sounded surprised and disappointed. That's not quite what our patient said. No? No, he said you looked familiar. He said he was sure you'd met sometime in the past, but he couldn't quite remember how or where. He didn't say that when we met. Well, his memory is in a very fragile state. It can take him a very long time to process information. Again, I didn't know quite where this conversation could go from here. I was anxious to end it, but Mr. Stern had already thought ahead. I wonder if we could ask you a very great favour, he said. I would like to bring our patient to visit you at your home. He says he has this vague recollection of you, but he can't quite place it. Perhaps if he saw you in your usual surroundings, it might help him. Something in your home might trigger memories. No, I'm sorry. As I've told you, I'm quite sure that we've never met. I would certainly remember if he'd been to my home. But of course, I agreed. Mr. Stern was so very polite and so very persuasive, but I managed to put him off for a couple of days. It was Gemma's turn to stay with me midweek. She arrived looking stunningly, almost stupidly sexy. She'd had her hair streaked red and blonde. She had on this new leather coat, and she had her shirt unbuttoned so that she was displaying as much cleavage as possible. It was to her left breast that my attention was immediately drawn. As she came towards me to give me my greeting hug, I noticed that amid all the familiar freckles there was something else. What's this? I said, amused. You've stuck something something small and red, like a sticker dot, seemed to be attached to her breast. I bent down, partly to gain closer inspection, partly to nuzzle my face in the soft skin down there, and saw that it was a little red heart. Gemma giggled. Do you like it? She said. Wait a minute, you've tattooed it on. Yes, you know I've always wanted a tattoo. What's the matter, don't you like it? It's a tattoo, I said, unable to conceal my shock. I mean, that's sort of permanent. This thing's there on your breast forever. You're saying you don't like it? Well, that's just it. It's there forever, so if I like it or not is irrelevant. I'm going to have to live with it. But do you like it? I would have liked some mourning. It's going to take some getting used to. It's just a tattoo, for Christ's sake, said Gemma, buttoning up her shirt. I'll cover it up. You won't have to look at it. I'm not saying that. I couldn't say what I wanted to say. That the tattoo looked horrible. It was because of the colour. From a distance, it looked like a stab wound. Gemma buttoned herself right up to her neck and then looked at her watch. I can still get the last train back if I leave now. I'll give you a call sometime. No, don't go, Gemma, don't be... I could have chased her down the stairs and out into the street begging her to come back, but I didn't have the will. In a way, I was glad to be left on my own. I needed to think about things. The shock of seeing the heart tattooed on Gemma's pretty breast stayed with me all evening. I still hadn't told her about the amnesiac. She knew nothing about the Three of Hearts playing card, his only link to another human being. To see one of those hearts on her breast felt like a terrible intrusion. I'll stop there. Thank you.
You can all hear us here? Yeah?
Yeah.
Great, okay. You have to tell us what happens though, because I'm blind. So does the guy get his memory back, and do they know each other? Or how do they know each other?
Well, I mean, that's a big giveaway. I mean, if I say that, the whole story rests on whether...
Okay. Leave them wanting, leave them wanting, buy the collection.
Want to buy the book.
Okay.
Never know.
Yeah, and there's another story in the collection where, which is about memory or a sense of reality. I was thinking about this Union Street, about the man who thinks there's a train station.
Yeah.
And when he arrives, there is no train station.
Yeah.
And it never existed. He's been looking forward to this train station. He can describe it. He's been so there's this kind of so it's sort of, it reminded me again when you're reading it, that sense of either false memory or sort of gap in reality that you're not quite sure whether this is real or not, and whether it's just some sort of something that's playing out in someone's head. Is that something that registers with you?
Yes, I mean, I've been very interested in memory as a thing to write about for a long time. I mean, obviously we use memory all the time in writing, just to draw on experience, to make stories out of. But actually writing about memory itself is something I've started doing more. Obviously that story is the most direct way I've tackled the subject so far. But yes, the other story as well, Union Street, I hadn't really thought of that in relation to the story I've just read. But that's a story about someone who's in this Midwest city, and when he comes to leave the city, he can't find a train station because there isn't one. But he's sure he has his train ticket and everything, and he remembers arriving on the train station just disappeared. No one knows about it. And that's actually, I wrote that, I was commissioned to write a story about railways. And I was in America, and the volcano, the Icelandic volcano had erupted. If you remember that, and all the flights were stopped, and I was stuck in Denver for a week. And I thought, well, I've got to write this story. I had this deadline coming up, so I wrote the story there. And my wife said, why don't you set it in Denver? Where there is a station, called Union Station. Actually, we were staying in Boulder, which is near Denver. And although we could hear the trains going past, we couldn't find the station. So she said, why don't you write about the station that isn't there? So, but then, yes, that becomes a sort of a way of exploring memory as well.
And so when you said memory, it also reminded me, I was reading an interview that you'd done in The Guardian, I think, where you were talking about how you felt that you'd really hit your stride as a writer when you started using your own life as source material. Yeah. But that was in your novels particularly, and yes. I wondered, does that transfer in also into your short stories, or do you see the two forms completely separately in terms of your creativity?
No, I mean, pieces that I write use memory to different degrees. You know, some of them, I mean, the novels were very autobiographical and drew heavily on memory. The Legoland story doesn't at all. But other stories in the collection do. I mean, there are some very autobiographical short stories that deal with a sort of remembered episode or incident. And don't just tell it, but make it into a story. I mean, it's not just recounting the memory, it's making it into a story as well. And I'm interested in how sometimes that's easy to do somehow with a memory. Sometimes a memory just lends itself to being a story or a poem, or even a novel, and others just don't. I mean, I often struggle with a story that might be based on a memory, and you just can't make it into a story. You just can't make that memory, no matter how sort of evocative it is for you. There's no narrative interest in it somehow. There's no struggle or whatever. Maybe it needs to be a poem or something like that. And often it's a question of deciding what form a particular experience or memory should be written in.
I was reading something you'd written today about how you were sitting in your grandfather's lap. He started telling you a story about when the two cars had met in this road.
That's right.
Yeah, and this driver refused to move for your grandfather.
That's right.
Yeah, and he comes out with an entire heart.
Yeah.
And he tells you the story in his life. And then, of course, I've read your collection, so it's Smoke, isn't it?
That's right.
Where that happens as well. So I guess what I was thinking, there was this idea of memory and autobiographical elements coming into your stories. Is that something that happens often for you, or just in that particular moment?
Yeah, I find I'm terrified to write nonfiction because of I don't think people will invite me to cocktail parties anymore. If I can put it in fiction, they just think I'm interesting. But yeah, pretty much all the stories are based on some craziness that has been presented in my life, and I'm a very fortunate man now. I'm in an elite class of fortunates. I don't want anyone to feel sorry for me, but as a younger man, probably more than my share of death and violence surrounding me, and stories my grandfather told me about hitting people with tire irons, and I think I came to storytelling and writing as a way to put order to the great disorder of me making sense of my own anger and my own grief as a younger man. And I think that's mainly what Volt ended up being, is a collection of me exercising all of this stuff in one way or another, yeah.
I'm glad to hear you moved on, because your collection is pretty dark. I wouldn't, and I'm in the same hotel, so I wouldn't be having many drinks with you.
I'm fine.
You look it. Gerard, you're a novelist, poet, short story writer. Now, when I think of short stories, I often think they're more akin to poetry than they are a novel, for example. And I wonder, do you have the same feeling when you're writing? Do you see them as kind of a sort of an extension of poetry, or?
I think they're somewhere in between. They're definitely somewhere in between novels and poems, and I think, but they're very much their own thing. I mean, the important thing is for me, is to sort of remember that a short story is distinct from both of those, and has its own special qualities. But I think a breakthrough for me in writing short stories, I think out of the three that you've mentioned, the three forms, I think for me it's been the hardest. It's the one that's been the most struggle to write that worked. I think that the breakthrough was realising that sort of balance between prose and poetry, and that there are certain qualities in poetry that really lend themselves or find expression in short stories, to do with the economy and the compression and the value of each word, all that sort of thing, really matters in short stories. I mean, it should matter in novels as well, but it can't to that extent. You can't write a whole 300-page novel with that same sort of attention to detail, maybe, unless you spent very long time writing it. But a short story does have shares those sort of details, sort of aesthetic qualities.
Yeah, it's like every word is taking you towards the end of a short story, and I think in a poem as well, every word has to count. I think also when you think of that, I think that it's like an essay in a film, where if someone leaves their keys and locks the door, and we see that, we know that that's going to cause problems later on. In a novel, that doesn't necessarily happen.
No.
You know, so you have that kind of, and I know that you've been starting to write film scripts.
Yeah.
And I wonder, you know, we were talking about this slightly about the connection there with poetry, say, and a short story. Do you think that there's a connection between film and short story? Because there's some really fantastic examples, and I have a bit of a theory on that. I just wonder what your thoughts are.
I think there's a tremendous advantage of being a short story writer and understanding how to make everything mean something on the page. I mean, when you go to film, the conversations I have with producers and creative executives for studios is they're actually going to be paying an enormous amount of money to have this thing made. And so for them, it's a necessity that everything means something. Like, what do you mean we're going to have something here that doesn't mean anything? I think it's very healthy. Sometimes, I've been doing this for about a year, doing the film end, and I've been thinking about, as a professor teaching people in writing, that sometimes we get spoiled that it doesn't cost us anything to write, and we get spoiled somehow. We can just put anything down, and it doesn't cost us anything. There's no repercussions of writing nonsense. You know, like, well, no, it's my beautiful piece here. Like, there might be some better novels in the world if, you know, we had to pay some money to have it made. Then again, there's lots of bad films too, so I'm not really. But for me, it's been greatly helpful as a short story writer coming in. I do say, and I've had a great experience, I heard lots of horror stories with film, but I do often feel like I'm the smartest guy in the room, which is nice.
Clearly, I felt that when I met you last night in the bar. I was thinking.
Not last, just with Hollywood.
On that note, I'd like to invite Alan Heathcock up to read. Alan's fiction has been published in many of America's top magazines and journals. His stories have won the National Magazine Award in Fiction. Has been selected for the inclusion in the Best American Mystery Stories anthology. Vault is the collection you'll be reading from. Yeah, you can stay there for a second. It's a long bio, my friend, and the best in 2001. It's selected for numerous magazines selected as best of the year. He's currently a literature fellow for the state of Idaho and a native of Chicago. He teaches fiction writing at Sierra Nevada College.
College!
Yeah, thank you. All that fucking wrong.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here. Ireland's beautiful. Cork's amazing. I've been trying to check off my boxes. Saw my first castle today. I kissed a Blarney Stone. And then everyone told me I shouldn't have done that. But I feel pretty good about it. I've gargled with some Listerine. And I still feel quite eloquent, so. I was going to read something that I've read 100 times before, and sitting there crazily, I've decided to read something that I've only read once and that I feel quite scared about reading, but it seems like maybe you have to do that at some time, and that might make for a better event. So, what to say about this? I'll just say what the story's about. I wrote this scene in one sitting, and I looked up from that day's work, and I kind of immediately knew that I had done something that I wasn't sure I had wanted to do, and, but that I couldn't delete it and that I would have to live up to it. So, America, things aren't going great right now, and so I'm writing about a civil war that could break out any minute. And for what I'm going to read right now, all you need to know is my protagonist is named Mazzy, and she's a 22-year-old former military who's been relieved of military duty after her mother dies, and she has to return home because there's no one at home to take care of her 10-year-old sister, Ava Lynn. There's a huge storm that produces massive flooding, and as they're trying to get away from the flood, they also run into what they haven't yet figured out is the beginning of a civil war that's breaking out in America. Mazzy has been separated from her sister Ava Lynn, and she's stuck on this hilltop camp that used to be a Christian summer camp for children. They have one boat, and she went and asked the pastor who runs
camp for the keys to the boat, and he couldn't give it to her because he has to think of everyone who's there. So now she's going to steal the keys to the boat so she can go find her little sister. And while she's sneaking into the chapel to go into the pastor's office to steal the boat keys, the chapel bell begins to ring, and everybody is being called to congregation. And so this is from a work in progress called 40. And please forgive me ahead of time. The organ music played, and from her, Massey's now hiding in the choir loft and waiting. The organ music played, and from her vantage, Massey can see the pulpit and half of the sanctuary. She shrank as far into the darkness as possible, trying to calm her breathing and figure her next move. The pews filled quickly. A few people dressed nice as for church, but most looking shabby and beaten. The pastor strode out to the pulpit. He wore a purple robe and sang along with the organ song. Many of the pews sang too. When the song was done, the pews were packed, a few even standing in the back and along the side aisle. The pastor asked everyone to bow their heads. Massey lowered her chin but kept her eyes up to watch the others. The pastor prayed for wisdom and for understanding in the hearts of the congregation. He said amen, and in the pause of silence, the pastor fingered the worn cover of the Bible he'd set on the pulpit's lectern. "What have we become?" he asked, his voice filling the room. "I've had this camp open now for 53 years. I've seen so much change. I've seen things changed and changed back as they were, fashions cycling through. I've seen 5 different wars. I've seen earthquakes ruin cities, seen new cities rise in their place. I've seen these storms get worse and worse," and he gripped the edges of the pulpit. "And I've read my Bible every day of those 53 years. Every day. I've done so to grant my life, my decisions for my life, my understanding of the world a context. I've seen that context shift over the years, some for good, some for convenience. This is to say that even the Bible has changed. I understand that's a dangerous thing to say, and yet I mean no blasphemy. Someday soon, we'll all be on a space station or in some new city on Mars, and who knows what it'll all mean then? All the stories of the Old Testament, all the wisdom of Christ. What does the creation story mean to us once we're gone from earth? What will Bethlehem mean to a child born on Mars?" And the pastor pushed up the sleeves of his robe and scanned the room. "There's a sermon I've given in my mind many times, but I've never preached aloud. It's one of those talks that seems to have come from the darkest of truths, and it greatly scares me. I was pacing my office again last night, asking God for wisdom, as if God didn't deliver me into this insight into the first place. I don't believe in the devil," he said loudly, clearly. "I believe it is only us, just us. Jesus was going to the cross, paraded through the streets, a crown of thorns on his head, hoisting his own cross that carried to Calvary. Judas gave him up. Peter denied him. And what did we do to save him? What did you do? Oh, I wasn't there. You say it wasn't me, but you were there. You've always been there. You're there right now. Let's be honest. Can we be honest? Just for once," he said, his voice rising. We've gotten exactly what we want. This rain, this war, or whatever ugly thing is happening out there, it's exactly what we want. And the relief we feel is tremendous. The power of knowing the thing you want has finally come to fruition makes you feel like a god. Let's be honest. It's what you want. You want the world to collapse. You want people to be every terrible thing, and so it's ordained. I'm one of you, he said softer. I'm no different. I'm not trying to shame anyone. I'm done with shame. Done with fear and doubt all my life. I've been afraid, been ashamed, doubting I'll be understood. This is what I'm saying. I'm saying that I believe God gives us exactly what we want. I'm not talking about what you say you want, though that's a part of it. I mean, you get all of the things that reside in that sacred place of truth behind your eyes. Every last thought becomes the world. Every prayer, but not just your prayers, their prayers too. Their prayers too. You get all of the hatred and bigotry and perversion and all the harm you need done to those not like you, those who threaten you and them to you, and you get every self-destructive desire too, because we hate ourselves and we hate each other. Stop it! A man's voice shouted from the pews. The pastor stood straighter and gazed out in the direction of the voice. And people muttered, shifted in their seats. Mazzy inched forward to see a man with thick brown beard and green hunter's cap glaring up at the pastor from the third pew. God gives you everything you want, son, the pastor said. Stop it. That's about all we ever say, isn't it? Stop making me feel bad. Stop making me work. Stop asking for peace. Stop making me love. Even that. Love costs too much. Takes too much effort. I am tired of fighting for love. I can't keep hoping. Hope hurts too much. Stop it. That's exactly what we said to Christ. We say that we love him, but the truth is he asks too much of us. Be merciful. Be meek. Resist not evil. Turn the other cheek. What weakness. What cowardice. Isn't that what you think? None of it gives us what we want, that strength, that power over our fears, over others, that utter destruction. Stop it. Fine. Fine, the pastor said, patting the air. God is listening to everything you say and don't say. God gives you what you want. He put Christ on that cross, and Christ yelled out to his Father, "Thou hast forsaken me." And God's answer was clear. I have not forsaken you, son. I've simply given them what they want. Chatter riffled through the pews, and the bearded man stood and sidestepped by the others to the mid-aisle and stormed out the back of the sanctuary, the door opening and banging closed. And the pastor leaned hard over the pulpit, rubbing his forehead. "Listen," he said, his voice faltering. "Listen, you want me to talk about the end days, don't you? About the 4 horsemen and the stand for us all? I know that's what you want, so you can feel it's all something beyond you, that we're just a victim of this great invasion. No," he said, shaking his finger like scolding a child. "No. It's your heads and your horns and your crowns. If God only gives us what we want, then we must worship want. Want must be most sacred, above everything, above love, above peace. Our God is want, and want is God, and what we want is this world that we've made, this world that we've Maid! And as he heard a shuffling out in the sanctuary, people were standing and filing out of the pews. What do you want? The pastor called after those leaving. What do you? And the organ started playing, arousing him, drowning out his words. And the pastor turned as if astonished toward the wood woman in yellow playing the organ. And his back slouched forward as if he might be sick. His lips quavered, though no sounds came out. Even the few that had remained in the pews now rose to leave. And the pastor turned to face the cross above the choir loft. Massey slid low against the wall. Then the pastor seemed to look directly at her. He took 3 steps toward her, squinting. Massey held her breath, her blood brittle, her heart made of birds. The music abruptly stopped, and the pastor whirled again towards the organ. Why? The organist bitterly shouted. Massey heard the footsteps and watched the woman in the yellow dress hurried out the chapel doors. In the chapel now empty, the pastor collected his Bible from the pulpit and slunk away. Massey heard the side door open and knew the pastor was heading back to his office. She descended the steps and pushed through the door. She crossed down off the stage and past the organ pen. At the end of the hall, Massey turned the knob and stepped into the office. The pastor didn't move in his desk chair, didn't offer a word or a nod of greeting. Massey sat across the desk from him. She felt inside her that frigid weeping guilt of someone confessing a crime. I think it's just like you said about want and all that. I think I must have wanted my mama gone, and then she was. I must have made it happen. I think I made this flood too. I think I must have wanted it all. The pastor swallowed. Your mother's gone? Massey nodded. But when she was gone, I can only remember the things I loved about her. I wanted her back all the more, but that one didn't seem to matter. Yes, the pastor said, as if she'd spoken a deep truth. Pastor, and he lifted his head. Is there a heaven? And the pastor finally gave her his eyes. I believe so. What if there ain't? Do you want there to be a heaven? I don't know. I mean, what is it? All I ever heard about was angels and harps and stuff. He placed his hands on his knees and slowly stood. He stared at his desktop. I've often wondered why I live here at this camp teaching kids silly songs, trying to teach them something small and safe about the Lord. Years ago, we had a very wealthy donor who owned a place overlooking Central Park in Manhattan. Told me how much the place was worth, and it was an outrageous number. The pastor walked over to the window and set his fingertips to the glass. This is all we have. This world. That view in the park he spent so much on, more money than I'd see in 10 lifetimes. Did me no better than standing on my old bridge and watching the river pass beneath. Much as I adore my own view, I know a view can only do so much in matters like this. We're always hoping to push through into something better, better house, better car, better meal. Men start wars thinking of what they'll pass into, but it all comes back to this. This is all we have, trees and rocks and water and sky. He turned to Massey. Unless you have heaven, I have heaven too. But I won't fight for it. One should never fight for heaven. Why fight for something no one can take from you? Massey stared into her lap, not understanding what he was telling her, afraid now she'd say it wrong. What you said about God giving us what all we want? I just wish I didn't want nothing. That would be my heaven,
Place where you ain't gotta want. The old man peered off as if in deep contemplation, and then a look of horror broke over him. He shut his eyes and clenched his teeth. Thank you, my dear. What for? He eased back to sit in his desk chair. Heaven is a place without want. That's it. That's all I should have said. They considered each other without speaking, and the pastor opened a drawer and pulled out a gray metal box, and from the box he drew out a set of keys on a chain with a plastic fob that showed a smiling bear and the word Hiipwa and a splash of red letters across the top. Go on and find your sister, the pastor said, and slid the boat keys on the desk across to Massey.
A little bit of time, not much, so I'm going to ask a couple of questions here, but get your questions ready. I'll be putting my glasses on so I can see you and everything, so I'll be intimidating you with my eyes quite soon. So maybe one question or two if you haven't. I was listening to that and I was thinking about your stories have a timelessness about it, right? Because they could be almost at any time in the last couple of hundred years, even longer, because they're about farmers and people who have sort of, on the outside, sort of quite small lives, but actually their emotions are quite operatic and huge, and they live these big lives. So, and that fascinates me, and I think that it clearly fascinates you as a writer, and I wondered where that comes from, do you think? Well,
I've been to small towns. Small American towns, at least a lot of them, the ones that my family are from, are filled with great drama. They're small towns and they're timeless, and even though my cousins are on Facebook with me now, you go back to Linville, Indiana, and there's still dynamite blasts 3 times a day, and you still have people mining coal and limestone quarries and people working hard lives. And when the reviews of my book came out and I became the Prince of Darkness, I went down to Linville and my Auntie Cheryl said, "Don't people know that this is just life for some people? You know, if that's not life for them, then goody two-shoes for them, but tell them to go shut up about it." And so that's kind of, my experience. There's something big, I've had cousins killed in hunting accidents, cousin killed in farming accidents. When I go down there, they take me a tour. This is where I pulled the naked girl out of the limestone quarry after she was so high on meth she drove her car into the water. Everything is mythic. It's got this big quality to it, but it's also just life. My grandfather was the postman, and he would tell me stories about finding people who'd laid down on the railroad tracks, and they knew everything about everybody. And there was a certain amount of hope and beauty to this place, a tremendous amount of love. But it's also, filled with this kind of mythic desperation.
And you, the darkness that does run through your stories, that kind of, the big passions that drive people to do almost insane things. And that's your territory, really, isn't it? That's where
I tried to write
as in like your mental writer territory, not
yes.
yours. I'm saying you actually live in that.
I tried to write a love story, and I wrote a love story, a cute little love story, because I was afraid I was becoming the Prince of Darkness. I wanted to change things up a little bit, because I love my wife, I love my kids, I'm filled with love. I'm a happy-go-lucky guy in my public persona. I'm like, what's going on here? Everyone knows me more by my book than people actually know me as a human being, and it was disturbing to me. So I sent this love story off to my agent. She's a very busy woman, and she never actually calls me, but my phone rang. She said, "What are you doing?" I'm like, "Well, I just wrote this love story." She said, "Oh, it's not any good." And I'm like, "Well, I just wanted to write a love story." She's like, "Yeah, I know, sweetie." She said There are things because of who you are and the world you've been in and the experiences you've had that give you deep insights into being able to write the stuff you can write better than other people who have not had those experiences. So it's a lovely story. We're not going to send it out anywhere. And I've learned to live with it and appreciate the great joy it is. Finding out, traveling all over the place, that grief has no demographic, and I've traveled all over the world, and I hate book clubs because you go and they just want to drink wine and have some desserts and enjoy each other's company, and in America I'm sure they're this way too. But even in book clubs, like this group of ladies having this lovely party, they don't want to talk about grief and awfulness. But after we break up, they always come to me one by one and they're like, I had this thing happen to me and my family. And it creates this beautiful intimacy that I didn't know that I would have the capacity for, because it's a weird kind of intimacy to share the grief of violence and tragedy. But I found it quite beautiful to form this relationship with all kinds of people in all kinds of different places. Martha's Vineyard to southern Indiana, and it's everywhere. So I found that quite beautiful, and I'm now quite proud to my moniker is the Prince of Darkness.
And I know, Gerard, they say that happiness writes white. Do you agree with that?
Yes, probably, to a certain extent. It's very hard to write about anything without conflict of some sort, because the happiness has to happen in the context, of non-happiness. So, yes, it's very hard.
I know that what struck me, there are lots of differences between you two as writers and the stories that you choose to work with, and I think there's a real, what I get from you is a kind of sort of moral certainty. There's a kind of pastor's fist through your stories. Sort of, that's good, this is bad, this is the way people are, and it's basic, and there's a kind of sort of animalistic tone sometimes as well. And I think with yours, I feel like there's a sense of that there's a playfulness, and they're more they're less certain. We're less certain as a reader what's actually happening, whether this is real. The characters aren't quite certain. People aren't certain whether that's their husband or not coming to the door. They're not certain. Did they misremember the husband? Did they forget that there was a tree? So there's a very different place that you're coming from. And I wonder, are you quite aware of that as a writer? Do you sit and go, he's the Prince of Darkness? So do you have a kind of name inside? You go, this is me. This is my domain. This is my territory that I work in.
I feel, I don't know, I think, it's hard, it's very hard to answer that.
That's a good question.
I think,
Saved it for last.
I'd have to reread all my stuff.
No problem. Right, you can sit in the bar later on. Should we?
I think playfulness is important. Something I like to do in stories especially is take characters and just sort of give them, problems or obstacles, or test them in some way, and also the reader, so that, yes, I think that does come back to the sort of unreliability of the narration and the characters themselves.
Yeah, and you'll take that into the kind of surreal.
Sometimes.
Yeah, so where you can, so you'll even give them problems that are actually, based on our reality, so that sort of expands the story out even further in a sense, doesn't it?
Yeah. I'm torn between stories. I'm torn between a sort of a steady sort of realism, quite down to earth realism, and sort of fairy stories, sort of fantasy and invention. So there's both those sorts of stories are in the collection. But I suppose recently I've been more drawn towards realism, to a sort of really sort of, this is the world as we know it type of realism, where things don't happen that can't happen in reality. I don't know if that will persist.